So this is the topic of today's session. We're going to talk about this extreme migration voyage, which is like so many have made to come to other parts of the world. But this one was extremely difficult voyage, and a large number of people, without any spoilers, a large number of people died on the voyage. So our speaker today is Michael Veitch, who is written a number of comedy television shows. Some of you in some parts of the world might be familiar with Degeneration, Fast Forward, Full Frontal, these things, and also been in movies like The Magic Pudding, Brilliant Lies, some of you will know those, and has written a number of books on the Second World War aviation and marine science, various things, travel. So this is Michael's latest book about the hell ship Ticonderoga. And he tells the story about his ancestor, who was the assistant surgeon on that ship. Some of you will have read the book, I guess. He says that every family has a story, and this is the story of one of the stories of some of his ancestors, his ancestor who was on this ship. On this website that you see here, he has talked about how to go about researching the story of your family. So that's very relevant to our group, isn't it? To read his advice on how to go about researching your family. The book's available from a number of sources, I know. Some people said that from certain jurisdictions they can't access it. They might only, someone in Britain told me they could only access the audio book. That's Michael reading his book. In some parts of the world you can buy it at a book depository or other bookshops, and you should be able to buy it on Kindle. So we might share some experience on that later. The book has received great critical acclaim and unanimously excellent reviews. And he had been started on a one-man stage play of the story before the virus came and the plays had to be cancelled. There was even planned to be an online performance where you could watch it online from the theatre where he was to have done it live on the 22nd of this month. But in fact, only last night, after last night's session, it was postponed. So you can't do that either. So I'll hand over to Michael, and then we'll come back to this slide after his thing. Michael, over to you.
Well, hello, and what an honour it is to be speaking to lovely people all around the world. And aren't we lucky that we're going through this collective international experience, at least with the sort of technology that we have to enable us to connect like this. What would our parents say about what we're able to do now? It makes my head spin sometimes. But hello, and thank you so much for joining us here today, and thank you, Bruce, for organising it. So yes, as Bruce sort of outlined, without giving too many spoilers away, actually you did give a couple of spoilers away, Bruce, so I'll smack you for that later. It's a story of this my book that I wrote concerning a story that had been knocking around my family for 3 or 4 generations regarding what was in the very new state of Victoria in the 1850s, its biggest story yet. Victoria, Australia, people know, only became a country in 1900. Prior to that, it was a series of colonies that basically hated each other and were fierce rivals. But they were sort of semi-autonomous little provinces, all under the aegis of the British Empire, and stemming from our convict past, and then moving into other aspects of our history in the free settlement days. But the story goes back further than that. The story really goes back, and I'll just briefly touch the background. It goes really to Scotland of the time. It's one of its most famous epochs, the Great Rebellions of the middle of the 18th century, where, of course, as many of us know, the last of the great uprisings, which was doomed to fail from the very get-go, I've always thought, and the Battle of Culloden in 1745, I think it was. And the aftermath, of course, was the dismantling of the Highland culture, the outlawing of their clan system, the dissolution of their legal systems, the outlawing of their language, etc., etc. And these poor kind of Highland Scottish tenant farmers who'd often remained working on the same plot of land for up to a millennium were suddenly found themselves in this most extraordinary position, because having been beaten and then forgotten about and ignored, they now found that their land was prime real estate, because the wheels of the British Industrial Revolution had got going, and suddenly their beautiful verdant glens and bucolic Highland mountain scenery, which I'm sure many of us have visited, became, in the eyes of people further south, ideal places to graze sheep. And sheep suddenly became a premium in this period of history, because the mills of Manchester and London and Birmingham were voracious. They could use every ounce of wool that they could get, and they could not get enough of it. Australia's incarnation, as I said, out of one of its incarnations out of the convict area was wool. Britain took every ounce of Australia's wool clip year after year after year, but they still wanted more. And they realized that up north, in this neglected area of the United Kingdom, full of wild people who were uncivilized and barbaric, and strangely had very few legal rights as tenant farmers. It's a strange thing that the tenant farmers of England had a far more greater legal rights than the tenant farmers of Scotland. There was very little legal tenure that the Scots had under Scottish law, whereas it was actually much harder for a landlord to throw an English tenant farmer off his land for no reason. Not so in Scotland, and particularly in the Highlands. And there was a division, we should say, between not just the Scots and the English, but the Highlanders and basically everybody else. As this area of England became a bit more fashionable, the lowland Scots almost started to mimic the English in manners and language, and this began to, the people around Edinburgh and Glasgow would associate far more with the English than they would with their northern neighbours, who were still regarded as a sort of a series of wayward tribes in a godforsaken, sort of crazy, wild part of the world, ripe for the picking. Because of course nobody up there owned their own land. It was all owned by the lairds in England and further south. And they were more than happy to assist the English in the expulsion of the Highland Scots tenant farmers. And that's what happened over a very cruel and I think often still very neglected period of history known as the Highland clearances. John Preble's book, which I lent on very strongly in my research, gives an extraordinary, heartbreaking account of what it was like for these Gaelic-speaking farmers who had never strayed more than 5 miles from the place of their birth to be suddenly being expelled from their traditional family homes and farms, which they had managed brilliantly for hundreds and hundreds of years. They had nowhere to go. They were made to be crofters. They were sent to the extremities off their laird's property. They were sent to the Scottish Isles, where they were made to do things like farm for kelp and fish and lime burning, which trades they knew nothing about. And so they gradually became, excuse me, more and more destitute, to the extent where some sympathy was shown towards these this large body of the populace who were in increasingly dire straits. And what we think is one of the world's first charities was established to get them out of there, to help them. And really the only way to help them was to get them out of there. it was the first one was the Highland and Island Emigration Commission, and that morphed into a much larger organisation around the 1830s, 40s, the Colonial Land and Emigration Commission. And basically it was designed to raise money, private money. The British government wanted no truck with giving public government money to any kind of charity, particularly to these mad bastards up in the Highlands. And so it was all privately funded. But what it really bought them was a one-way ticket out of there. And the Scots landowners, the English, said, whoopee, they're off our hands. Now we can put sheep, we can run sheep in the Highlands. And that's why when you go through the Highlands now, I'm sure you know this, and you know, you could pick up a car in Inverness and have a wonderful few days driving across, only it doesn't take that long actually, to get across, not in Australian terms and Canadian terms anyway, but to get across the northern part of the Highlands. You see everywhere little tumbled down blocks of granite lying on a hill or nestled in the nook of a little gully. And they're all villages, and they're all villages that were full of people up until, well, the beginning of the 1860s and 70s, where from what time, from which time onwards, going for about 100 years, they were expelled and sent to places like Canada and Australia, also to the United States. But the British government didn't have anything to do with that because America was no longer a part of the empire. So this draining of the population was facilitated by these organizations, which basically bought them a one-way passage on a ship. And it was a service that, plodded along. I think it worked out. There were agents that went up to the Highlands and gave speeches in town halls saying, look, you're in dire straits and everybody knows that, and there's no hope for you except to get out. And here's a one-way ticket. I think they had to put up a couple of quid or something, or in fact, sometimes it was even waived. But they were given, if they applied for it, and they were given a berth on a ship. They relaxed the rules to enable little children to come. It was figured that it was good for the men to have their families with them. And so this mass exodus, this diaspora, the great Highland diaspora, one of the great Highland diasporas, began around this time. In Australia, meanwhile, exactly the reverse was happening. You had this series of strange events. Australia was still a penal colony, but it fought with being a penal colony and being a free settler area. And the governments of the Australian colonies were constantly lobbying London, saying, look, you can't just make us a penal colony. We're better than that. Bring free settlers out. And the British said, well, we still want to get rid of them, and it's actually convenient, and it's the other side of the world. We never have to think about them again. So maybe we can do both. And it was always a bit of an oil and water, unlike New Zealand, which was a free settler colony from the get-go. It was actually much smoother there, I think. But I think that clash between the two societies of convicts and free people in Australia probably led to some sort of elements of the formation of the Australian character, I think. But certainly it was a battle that was fought over many, many decades in Australia at that time. But the baseline is that people were needed, particularly women were needed, domestic servants were needed. As people started to get money, make money on things like wheat and wool, that's how the kind of society started to grow, and people wanted labour and people wanted wives, all sorts of things. So the Scots were given this rather tantalising proposition, is that, look, you're not wanted here, you're kind of human refuse here, but in Australia, you're desperately needed and you'll be treated like gold. And they took up the opportunity in great numbers. Then a series of things happened. There was a terrible recession in the 1840s. The economy started to collapse. We're plagued with drought constantly in this country, and so the wool clips were very low, and there wasn't much demand for it. But then suddenly, in 1850, gold was discovered in the state I live in, Victoria, and gold like nobody had ever seen before. It made the California gold rush look like a speck in a pan. And I was reading just the other night, from the last 4 decades of the 19th century, 85% of the world's gold came from Victoria alone. It was for a time apparently so much gold in Victoria that you literally could walk down a riverbed and pick up nuggets. That lasted about a week, of course, when people discovered that, but that's what it was like initially. So that's the scale of the Victorian gold rush. It was massive. And it was a massive impact on the United Kingdom because now everybody wanted to come here. So the British government were in a dilemma. Suddenly their dreams were answered. They had more people wanting to get out of the place, which suited them, to allow their country to be used by sheep, than they could handle. So they hired ships, big ships. And what happened at this stage also was that the biggest ships in the world were starting to be built by the Americans in the form of the great American clipper ships, unlike anything that I'd ever seen before. For people who know aeroplanes, it was like the new clippers that were built in Boston and New York were so different to the ships, the existing ships at the time. It was like an old tiger moth compared to a space shuttle. They were faster, they were bigger. Nobody had seen anything like these big American ships ever. They were enormous, over 1,000 tons, when most British ships were 400 or 500, 600 maybe maximum. They could transport vast numbers of people, and particularly in the climax of this scheme to get these Scots out of the country, its zenith was around the year 1852, when 4 very large ships were commissioned. All American ships were commissioned to make the very quick run from the United Kingdom to Melbourne, because that was the starting point, because you came down the bottom and then you hit Melbourne, and then people dispersed usually. They often went to Sydney and sometimes up to Brisbane and other places too. And so on the 2nd of August, 1852, at the Birkenhead Emigration Depot, which was a wonderful setup. It gave these people who had been transported from their homes over the past week a chance to assimilate, to get lectured on what life was going to be like at sea. Bear in mind, a lot of these people had never seen the ocean. As I said, had never travelled within a few miles of their village, and now suddenly they were in Liverpool, a city beyond their imagination, about to get on a ship to go to the other side of the world, which may have been the other side of the moon. They were told to expect up to 100 days at sea. The ship, in fact, actually only took 90 days because the journey times were becoming faster and faster. They embarked on this beautiful big ship called the Ticonderoga, which was one of the big American clippers, the last one of that year to be hired by the British government. The first one was the Marco Polo, which broke the record on the sail from England to Melbourne. 72 days. No one could believe it until the captain of that ship held up the copy of the Liverpool Evening Standard that he'd grabbed from a paperboy as the ship was pulling out of the dock, and he held it up as he came into Melbourne, and people read the date and they could not believe what they were reading. 72 days, when you think Captain Cook 100 years earlier had taken 6 months for the same journey. That was the first one. The second was a ship called the Bournemouth. Then there was the Great Britain, and the last one was Ticonderoga, which set sail in August, with 800 passengers. And they had 800 passengers on it because, I'll show you a picture of what we think. What am I doing? Where's my share screen? Share screen's down the bottom. Yep. I'll just get this ready here, hang on. Share. Bruce, tell me if you can see the picture of the ship.
All good.
Okay, that is actually not Ticonderoga, because there is no image painting or beautiful old photograph, glass plate photo like that is, of Ticonderoga. This is actually called the, what was it again? The Aldenwick Castle, which was apparently identical to Ticonderoga. You can see it's a, well, you know, it looks beautiful to me. Look at all the rigging, 3 masts, so it could put up an absolute acre of sail. It was a fast ship with a beautiful sweeping bow and swallowtail hull underneath it, sort of made it push the water. But that's what it looked like. This thing had a second deck, which is very unusual. So the first deck was about there, and the second deck was almost at the waterline. And it meant they were able to get a very large number of people onto this ship. 600 were Scots from the Highlands, and 200 were from England and Scotland, and a few England and Ireland and Wales. But primarily it was a voyage of the Highland Scots on a one-way trip. They knew that they would never be coming back, traveling with their men, women in often advanced states of pregnancy, many children. The captain was an Irishman, Thomas Boyle, who sounds like a wonderful person, all told. The ship was very new. It even smelt new, apparently. It had only done a couple of trips back and forth across the Atlantic, taking cotton from the south to Southampton, I think. And then he got this very big job, very rewarding job in terms of financial reward, taking this ship to Australia. It had 2 surgeons on board. The main surgeon was an experienced surgeon called Dr. Joseph Charles Sanger, a man of about 10 years experience, and he had a young assistant too, who I'll get to a little bit later. The first few weeks of the voyage were apparently quite benign, quite successful. They sailed out of Liverpool Bay. The wind was kind and more sail was put on. And there's a very poignant moment as, clinging to the rails, these people watched the last sights of Britain disappearing under the horizon, the only land they'd ever known, and knowing they would never see it again. And now their life on board would be dominated by the ship's bell, which rang at 7 a.m. to wake them and called them to meals and called them to various services of religion. Called them to announce proclamations by the captain and Mr. Colley, the first officer. A few days later, they'd passed the southern tip of Ireland and were out into the great currents of the South Atlantic. Now, in former times, of course, you'd have some stops along the way, but not now, because we are now in the era of what was called the Great Circle. The phenomenon by which it was worked out that you could sailing in a curve is actually a more of a shortcut than sailing in a straight line, the earth being round, and we have ships that could do it and could get up the speed. So the idea, this notion developed by an English watchmaker called Thomas Towson and the famous Matthew Fontaine Maury in America, who was a cashiered sailor, and they worked out the currents and the tides and worked out that you could sailing right down the middle of the Atlantic, you could get great winds and great currents without stopping anywhere. You go straight down to the bottom of the world where you hit the great southern ocean, turn left, and with all the winds at your sail, because there's very wild winds that race around the bottom of the globe there, just below where I am, and that's called the Great Southern Ocean. That speedboats you across, and then you go up to Australia. So that's why they could suddenly do this voyage in a few months, and well, 70 days as Forbes did it, not months as it used to take. But it meant that once you're on the ship for these passengers, you stayed there. You did not see a speck of land from the time you left till the time you arrived. And just keep bearing in mind these people who had known nothing but land all their lives. The first few weeks were quite benign, quite happy. It was a happy ship. Everybody remarked on the crowding of the ship. There was no room. There was no privacy. The ship had been cleaned thoroughly. The the notion of illness at sea was very cognizant in people's, in the authorities' consciousnesses. They had cleaned it, they'd whitewashed it, they'd soaked it down with carbon chloride or something, some ghastly, highly toxic chemical these days, but it would have killed any germ around. And so the doctors examined every passenger, interviewed them, checked their clothes for signs of infestation and things like that. And so every passenger, not one passenger was apparently rejected, and all of them made it on board. But the conditions were, well, I've often said that even a good voyage in those days in one of these ships for us would have been absolutely unbearable. And this was not a good voyage by any means. And it started to present as not being a good voyage after about a month at sea. That first month, as I said, was quite happy. There are stories of the Highland girls, because there are a lot of single women going to pick up jobs as nannies and teachers and domestic servants. There were 2 married quarters for families. There was a single males area and a single females area.
Michael, can you describe the conditions of sleeping and cooking in the married quarters, family?
Yes. You were given, they called them desks. You were allotted a desk, and that was set up while you were still in the emigration depot, and you were made to practice sleeping with these people and cooking with these people. Extra bunks, I guess you'd call them, double rows of bunks had been put in along these narrow gangways and corridors of this ship. They reckon it was 18 inches across to fit. People were smaller in those days, admittedly, but 18 inches was what you had to sleep in, a little kind of, shelf. And you slotted yourself in there on a kind of straw stuffed palliasse, and that's where you slept. The hygiene was basically bedpans. There were some flushing toilets on the top deck, but you had to get there. And particularly, I often think for women in their 19th century garments, having to get up to relieve themselves, I mean, unbearable. And infants, seasickness, everybody was seasick. The smells of cooking, you were given food for which you had to cook your own desks of about 5 or 6 people's meals with. It was like communal living. The lower deck was virtually dark. There were a few scuttle lights, dark, thick green bottle glass let in a little bit of light, and of course a few whale oil, protected whale oil lamps. Whale oil gave off the most disgusting smell. So simply the smell of human bodies that didn't wash anyway. They didn't wash much on this voyage, that's for sure. There's nothing to wash with. Cooking, I mean, and this is before the disease got going, and I'll talk about the disease in a second. So the first few weeks, people talk about the laughter of children because the children just took over the place. The American crew were encouraged to be as kind as possible to the crew. The young single men wanted to often have a go at sailing a ship and learn the ropes, literally speaking. And the crew apparently facilitated that. They were happy to have the extra hands, and Captain Boyle kept a close eye on that. But he said, look, as long as they're happy and amused. There was a Highland country dancing on the top deck by the single girls, giving demonstrations of dancing, and someone found some bagpipes, and an American sailor brought a banjo, and an Irishman had a bodhrán drum, and apparently it was a happy atmosphere. It was hot because they were crossing the equator, really hot. That lower deck would have been absolutely stifling. And then apparently just as they were crossing the line and having the ceremony, Dr. Sanger approached his assistant and said, look, come down below. I think we have a case of disease on board. And a young girl, 16-year-old girl, her name was Anna Maria Hando, one of the minority English families. They were from Somerset, and she was presenting with a terrible fever. She was almost she was almost comatose and had a red rash across her body. And the two doctors looked at each other and with dread uttered the word typhus. Typhus was until really, and still up until the Second World War, Anne Frank died of typhus, was one of the great scourges of mankind up until we got hold of what caused it. An awfully cruel disease. It's quick. It's the only thing that's not cruel about it, but it's cruel for the people around you because it sends you into a fever that's so extreme. It sort of boils your brain. It gives you a terrible rash. The infection is absolutely rampant and voracious for the first few days. Your body explodes in heat. Your brain is very overcooked. You go into a kind of a violent delirium and you stink. One of the side effects is this ghastly a stench that even a single typhus patient, which can clear a whole hospital ward, I'm told, gives off. So add to that the conditions, the olfactory conditions of this ship, and then typhus takes hold beyond our imagination, thank God. It was not understood what typhus was. It wasn't discovered till during the First World War that typhus was actually, was and is transmitted by human lice. And everybody had lice. Everybody stank and everybody had lice up until about, 1920, probably even a bit later. A particular breed of lice, in fact, that has evolved with human beings called Pediculus humanus. And it's our own lice that has lived with us for thousands of years and has evolved to our bodies. Some strains of lice pick up a bacteria that, if it gets into our bloodstream, causes typhus. They had no idea about that. It was beyond their conception that this could be so in the 1850s. They thought diseases were transmitted by air, and they did their best to clean the air out of the ship, which probably just threw more lice, because they're tiny, through the population of the ship. But for whatever reason, typhus started to take hold after about the 5th or 6th week of the voyage, the 90-day voyage of the Ticonderoga, and it devastated the ship. Presented in the married quarters first, because what happens is when you're cheek by jowl and you're cuddling up and your children are around you, the lice travel from one person to another. You get bitten, you scratch, you force the bacteria that lives inside the louse into your bloodstream, instantly infecting you, and you can present within hours. Babies died like that. Babies getting it, because parents will know that babies, young infants with a fever, is very bad news. The fever that took over these babies killed them in droves. Men, women, bear in mind, in the 18th and 19th century, people died a lot and early, particularly infants and children, but adults as well, and particularly at sea. So, deaths at sea, particularly with young people. That other ship I mentioned that had arrived this same year as Ticonderoga, called the Bournemouth, that turned up to Melbourne. They'd suffered 88 deaths at sea, with only 600 passengers, but all but 6 of them were kids and infants, and nobody thought a thing of it. That was, that's a successful voyage. 88 deaths, all children. Imagine if that happened now. But this was then, this is now, and that was then. When adults started to die, it was a different story, and Ticonderoga was experiencing adult deaths in great numbers. After 6 weeks at sea, they'd lost 80 passengers. 9 weeks. After 9 weeks, they'd lost 80 passengers. 300 were sick, and the whole structure of the ship was starting to fall down just when it was the worst time to do so, because having these people boiled themselves crossing the equator, they are now heading into the South Atlantic Ocean, where the cold was terrible, and the storm started to come in, and people had to literally batten down in their hatches. It's very hard to imagine the trauma of what these people would have experienced. Not only sick, surrounded by death and dying and misery, but also in this wooden coffin like a cork on being tossed around by seas and winds and dreadful cold. Every item of clothing that they could wear was worn, and still they were freezing. And to warm up, they gathered together as one would, but this instead just propagated the disease. The two ship's doctors did their best. It's interesting to look at what constituted a doctor's kit in those days. I've looked at the list of what comprised the ship's doctor's medical chest on board Ticonderoga, and it's basically just booze. It's you know, medicinal wine, medicinal gin. It's all sorts of Madeira. There are bits of odds and sods like arrowroot, cream of tartar, mercury, which was used to treat things like syphilis back in those days. I don't think leeches were mentioned, but things like lots of oats and bran, which are fine. They're not going to do you any harm, but they're not going to do you much bloody good either. But that's what they thought, and that was where we, you know, even, it's such a shame because even 10 years later, they would have had more of a handle on disease when they started to get into that great debate as to what disease actually was, which only really started to happen in the 1860s. But anyway, I digress. So there was really not much the doctors could do to tackle this dreadful typhus epidemic that had broken out on board their ship. Some just happened to think that maybe having a wash was good, and that seemed to do some work, some good work. Sponge bathing with salt water. Can you imagine when you're sick? It seemed to cool people down, but it seemed to wash them as well. And there were some instances of people recovering from that. It didn't kill everyone. It's a strange disease, typhus. It seems to be very random. It just doesn't have the same impact, like COVID, I suppose, doesn't have the same impact on one person as it does another. They finally hit the ghastly extreme latitudes of the Great Southern. At one point, Ticonderoga was probably about 800 nautical miles north of the northern part of the Antarctic continent in October 1852. You can imagine what it was like. The Great Southern Ocean is an extraordinary ocean. It's unique because it's got no land. It's right at the bottom of the world, just above Antarctica, below South America and South Africa. And there's nothing to stop it. There's no land. So the winds just go from west to east, just go round and round and round and round. And it's wild. It's completely wild. I lived in Tasmania for a while, and occasionally they used to say, oh, that's the, you can smell that. And so what is it? That dry kind of papery, crisp, white kind of smell. That's a mixture of Antarctica, which you can sometimes smell from Hobart, and also the winds of the Great Southern Ocean, which do not stop. That's why it was so good for ships, because it sent you along at 18, 20, 22 knots, which is the speed of a speedboat these days. So it did, thank goodness, the last part of the voyage quite quickly. More and more deaths at sea. The funerals, such as they were, had broken down. You could not bury someone at night in those days at sea. It was considered disrespectful. So the funerals had to be carried out in daytime. There was not enough hours in the day to do it. Corpses were basically stored, decomposing. Thank goodness it was cold on the top deck. Some were apparently washed off. Then they started to have funerals at night time too, just to clear the awful backlog as they started to track north. Dr. Sanger himself began to get sick. Suddenly the crew started to get sick. The crew generally were better off because they slept in hammocks. So lice didn't really trouble them too much, at least not from some other person. But of course, in the married quarters, you were next to your partner and your children, so that's why it was so bad. But when the crew started to go sick, the ship was in danger of not being able to sail itself. So the men had to work double shifts just to make up the shortfall. Help was called from the two ships' doctors. The main doctor, Dr. Sanger, started to get sick himself. So it was just the assistant surgeon, who was a very young man on his very first voyage, who had no experience really of what he was doing. He was assisted by a young woman, a young passenger, who just basically stepped up and said, look, I see you need some help and everything's chaotic and I'm not sick. And so they were this team. They were this team that did their best under terrible circumstances to alleviate the situation. Finally, after 100 dead, just on 100 dead, the ship limped into Port Phillip Bay. I don't know if, Melbourne sits at the top of a very large, virtually landlocked bay with a tiny, tiny gap down the bottom called the Rip, or the Heads, which opens out into Bass Strait, which opens out into the Great Southern Ocean. So they finally put their nose through this and through the Rip. They were into the bay. People were still dying. You couldn't bury at sea in the bay. The pilot, because there was a lot of traffic coming in at this time, and the reason there was so much traffic, I hadn't mentioned, gold had been discovered, and so there was a rush to get people in, yes, to Victoria. So there was a huge queue of ships waiting to be taken up by the pilot up to Melbourne, which was about a day's voyage. It's a couple of hours in the car now, but in those days it was a day's voyage sailing up, because it's quite shallow. You've got to go through channels. The pilot took a couple of days to get to Ticonderoga, and as it approached it in the pilot's cutter, he heard calls from the deck saying, "Don't come near us, pilot. We're sick, we're diseased, you'll die." And the pilot, God bless him, he did his job and he tied up and climbed up the outer stays, which are the things that hold up the main mast, the big ropes, and said, "What's going on here?" And he goes, "Oh my God," and sees this chaotic picture of a ship very badly trimmed. The sails were badly positioned because the crew was sick. No one was actually doing their job. He remembers seeing rope uncoiled on the deck, just in a heap, which was unheard of. British maritime law, you could be hung, drawn and quartered for not coiling a rope on a deck. But the system had broken down so badly. Under a piece of canvas, there were feet sticking out from canvas, a sheet of canvas. So he realized that this is a terrible situation. The captain said, "We're in a terrible situation. We have many dead. What do we do?" And he said, "Well, I'm sorry, Captain, sir, you can't come up to Melbourne." And he had to go to an area that the government had allocated as their brand new quarantine station, a couple of miles. And you could just see a little golden strip of sand, which is now called Port Nepean. And that was where they went. And he said, "Unload your people and do your best for them. I'll send word to Melbourne about this ship's arrival, and we'll take it from there." So that's what they did. They went another couple of miles across the bay and anchored, and the poor lime burners who were working there, they remember seeing this great big black ship come up to their beach and drop anchor, and they said, "Hello, this life as we know it is about to change drastically." And it was, because that was the foundation of Victoria's main quarantine station for the next 100 years. A makeshift hospital was set up on the beach. Thank goodness it was a warm November. Novembers in Victoria can be cold, but this was a warm one. And so for the next 6 weeks, people spread out on the sand under spare sailcloth. The spare, in fact, it wasn't spare sailcloth. I just read this the other day, and something I didn't put into the book. All the spare sailcloth had been used as shrouds for the bodies. So there was no spare sailcloth. So they had to rip the spars, the actual sails, off the ship and use them as tents, and the spars and the spare spars to just help people rest on the beach. It would have been an extraordinary sight. I mean, they were in the middle of nowhere, really, and suddenly 600 people were sort of on a beach in quarantine. Hello, that's what we are now too. Word was sent up to the government in Melbourne, and it was instantly a very, very big story. People hung off ship arrivals in those days. They didn't know when a ship was going to arrive, generally. The only, there was no telegraph to Australia at that stage. There was only letters, and often the letters had to come with ships. Often what happened is that mail would be exchanged sometimes mid-ocean, and you could get someone saying, oh, this ship is about to arrive, or this is left. So, but mainly people just waited for a ship to come through the heads, and it was alerted this ship has come, and people would come down to see who was on it. It could be a brother, it could be a mother, it could be people you knew, it could be people who you needed to work for you, all sorts of things. Bringing news from Europe, which is the only place people really cared about then. Ticonderoga's arrival as a plague ship was a huge disaster from the get-go. You know, the headlines, and I've seen the papers, I've actually gone through the archive of the Argus for that time, and it says, plague ship arrives, and they give details, and they're very lurid. 19th century newspaper writing was very lurid back then, and it tells of all sorts of ghastly things happening on board the ship. The government did go into action very quickly. They went down there to inspect the ship, sent a hospital ship, sent more doctors, and sent food and fresh water. And it was near some dairy areas, so milk arrived. So gradually people got better. Having said that, another 100 died. Those who were going to die, who were already sick, then did indeed go on to die. Not many picked up the disease once the passengers had been disembarked. Governor La Trobe, who was Victoria's first governor, because Victoria wasn't even a proper colony, it was what was called a crown colony, which means it had trainer wheels on and those strings were being pulled by New South Wales, came down himself, and which was a big deal because the papers were saying that he was a useless, effete ex-Navy wash-up, and he shouldn't have been given this job. The army hated him, because there was huge rivalry between the Royal Navy and the Army. They said, why have you got this French-loving fop to govern this now rich colony of Victoria? Apparently, New South Wales were livid because they grudgingly gave permission to Victoria to be carved out as a separate colony. Because they said, well, who cares about the bloody place anyway? It's the weather's awful and who cares about it? And then suddenly gold's discovered in Victoria. So New South Wales went, oh my God, why did we let that happen, that go through? But hardly was the paperwork signed when gold was discovered, and Governor La Trobe, who nobody liked, was doing a PR thing, came down in his full naval regalia, didn't go near the beach because that was where all the ghastly sick passengers were. He stayed on his ship and waved a bit, but that was enough. After a 6-week period of death and recovery, they filled out a little cemetery that was full within a couple of weeks. The ship was actually sunk to the gunwales. The Ticonderoga was sunk a bit for the water to clean out the muck. Everything was burnt from the inside. All the decks and the possessions and the beds were taken out, were burnt or thrown away, and people re-embarked. 200 short of who had embarked in Birkenhead 3 months earlier. They went up to Melbourne, and then the last tragic chapter, then they were stuck in Melbourne, in Port Melbourne, because the word had got around that this plague ship was coming, and the wharfies, the stevedores, did not want to touch it. And the union, the good old wharfies union, I don't know if there was one, but they acted as a union, said, well, they've actually put a black band on the ship saying we're not going near that. And so the passengers were then stuck for another 3 or 4 days within sight of mile or so of Port Melbourne, begging people to take them ashore. Meanwhile, all the beds had been taken out. So there's nowhere for them to even lie down. So they had to virtually lie on top of each other, having suffered the indignity. And one very poignant thing, as they were leaving the quarantine station to come up, apparently the last thing they did before they set sail was bring the luggage back of all the people that had died. And so you could still see the new painted names of the passengers on the luggage. and people watched the trunks and cases of the dead being loaded back onto the ship because it was still property that had to be disposed of properly, apparently. They finally bribed some dodgy ferry runner to take them all ashore in little bursts. And then just before, I think, Boxing Day, 1852, their voyage ends. They walk up the hill to what was the emigrants' depot. It was the big depot. It's gone now. It would have been a beautiful building. It's where they signed on. They said who they were, what their status was, and people having to sign for the first time, widow or widower, which is so sad. And how many children do you have? And often it was a lesser number that they had to put down than what they had signed on when they got on the ship 3 months earlier. In the session last night, people asked me, how did people fare after that? Well, it's hard to tell. Then they became part of the Australian Scots emigrant story. Some did very well. It's good to know that the single women probably did initially better than most, in that single, particularly child age bearing women were a premium in the colony of Victoria at that time, and anyone who could read or write was snapped up. There were touts. There were touts at the emigration depot who sort of went up to people saying, "Oh, have you just arrived? Can you read and can you write?" And they said, "Oh, yes, a little bit." Okay, and one crofter girl who had been completely poor, but she could write, was for the first she found herself in the middle of a bidding war. This 18-year-old girl looking at these two men either side of her, saying, "Oh, well, I'll give you, the people I'm representing will give you 9 shillings, 10 shillings. She ended up for the first 6 months earning a guinea a week, which was like, thousands of dollars a week. And she couldn't, looking back and forth, I'd wish. And after that, what the ship voyage had been so terrible, it's nice that those kind of stories happened. There was an inquiry, a commission of inquiry, not quite a royal commission. They didn't quite exist then, but a commission of inquiry was set up to work out what the hell had gone wrong, because this was considered a scandal. This was a government ship under the aegis of Her Majesty's government, bringing out free people. They were kind of quietly, the British thought them the scum of the earth, but that's not the point. They were free people under the protection of the government, and they had stuffed it up big time. It was decided simply that the ship was overcrowded. Just don't bring any more ships of that size to Victoria with those number of people. One of the heroes, if there was a hero on board the ship, was the young assistant surgeon who, with the young woman who helped him, this young passenger who stepped up as a nurse to actually do their best for people. They were regarded as sort of heroes for a short time. And this is them 50 years after those events. And he was my great-great-grandfather, James William Henry Veitch, and my great-great-grandmother. Can you see that, Bruce?
I think you need to scroll up. We're seeing your screen, but we can't see the picture.
Tell me when.
Not yet.
Oh, okay. I've got it.
Can
you see it now?
It's your screen, but we just can't see the picture of them.
Okay, just a second.
Can you see it? Maybe
I'm looking at the. All right. I'm gonna do this.
There you go.
I'll try doing that. Where are we?
There you go.
Can you see that? Sort of.
Down a bit. There you go.
All right. Well, that's James William Henry Veitch, my great-great-grandfather, and my great-great-grandmother, probably taken about 1905, 50 or so years after the event. I don't know why that screen's not working. It was working last night, but there you go. A little bit about him. He was considered. They were both fated in the papers for a little while, and as luck would have it, they married a few weeks after. They were both single people. James Veitch, that man, he never went to sea again, which was kind of interesting because there was no talk of him ever actually emigrating to Australia full time. He came from a very distinguished family. His father, James Veitch, I know a lot more about than him. James Veitch was a big deal. He was a highly respected medical doctor. The family were a dynasty of naval doctors. He was at Trafalgar. He knew the Duke of Wellington. He rose to be the Inspector General of Her Majesty's Hospitals, Naval Hospitals, and they had a home in Plymouth and the townhouse in the west end of London, which the hell we still had that. And so James was his son, his firstborn son, was also a doctor, and had his first job at sea. And there was no question of him staying in Australia. This was just his first gig. But I think, and I don't know this, and the family thinks that the voyage was so ghastly that he decided, I'm never setting foot on board another bloody ship as long as I live. And he had met this charming young Scots woman, probably who his father wouldn't have approved of. And so he settled here. And that's how my Veitch family arrived in Australia.
It's a great story.
He probably never spoke about it much either in his obituaries, when he died, and of course when he died, the obituaries, and which were quite fulsome, made no mention of it. And I think it's because it was probably like a war veteran. It was like, oh, you're on that ship, were you? Oh, tell us about it. And it was ghoulish. And so they just kind of forgot about it. And this was a story that my father knew about because he was a journalist, and he used to tell me about this story, but he never did anything about it. He was a newspaper writer, but I'm a writer, but I'm more of a book writer. So that's why I put the story together. And I should stop for questions now because I could ramble into all sorts of tangents. But
Michael, can you just stop sharing? Can you just stop sharing the screen? That'd be great.
Jesus.
Up the top. Wave your mouse up near the top.
I'll share and then I'll stop share.
Yeah. And before we go on to the questions and answers, I'd like to, and discussion generally, I'd like to ask Melanie, who's the Chief's Commissioner in Canada, to say a few words of thanks to Michael for having spoken with us today. Melanie, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Your narrative is riveting. Your ability to cast colorful visual images make for a really rich account of the voyage. And I just love the personal element. I love that this is a part of your family story. I think that makes it even better. And really well done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's very kind of you, Melanie. Thanks. Yes, it is quite a personal story. It was, and I did it because it's almost as if the family has been almost slightly haunted by the story. It was sort of it was something that wasn't spoken about. And so, but we're at a time now we can speak about the past in a different way. So that's why I put it together. So thanks for that.